What would Britain be like today without the National Health Service? Its existence is beyond political debate. Britain's health depends on it. But in the 6 months before it opened its doors, it looked as though it might never take its first breath. Hated and resisted by the very people who would actually make it work, its gestation was the most fiercely contested in British political history. And its many enemies wanted to crush it before it was born. This is the remarkable story of the battle for its life. In January 1948, Aneurin Bevan, the Labour Minister for Health, made one of the most audacious political promises in British history. In just 6 months' time, on July the 5th, free healthcare would be available to every British citizen. The National Health Service was the country's biggest and most expensive social reform ever conceived. Creating it from scratch in mere months would be a race against time, because from the outset, it faced bitter opposition. Winston Churchill's Tory party had fought Bevan's bill at every stage in the House of Commons. Britain was bankrupt after the most expensive war in history. How could we possibly afford it? The British papers were predicting disaster. The public would exploit a free-for-all. But the angriest and most passionate opponents of the National Health Service were the very people needed to make it work. The dentists, the surgeons, and most of all, the doctors. Doctors said the NHS would rob them of their independence and their freedom. They were all set for a fierce battle for their survival. Before the NHS, the health of the nation was in a perilous state. 1947 had been one of the coldest winters since records began. Snow blanketed the nation. The Thames froze over. And with the cold came the host of illnesses that every bleak winter is prone to. Those who couldn't afford heating were at serious risk. Something had to change. For decades, millions of British people had suffered illnesses that went untreated, because going to the dentist, the optician, even the ordinary doctor, cost money that few could afford. Between the wars, working-class children entered the world in a tenement or a back-to-back, freezing in winter, stifling in summer. Conditions that bred diphtheria, measles, scarlet fever. Thousands died from tuberculosis every year. A child who survived until 12 was likely to have rotten teeth, poor bones, and a weak heart, if they survived at all. Doctors did work in the slums, but very few. London's East End had just one GP for every 18,000 people. In the leafy suburbs, it was one for every 250. "It is not to every doctor's taste," said one GP, "to work 20 hours a day in the slums to earn as much as he could earn in 3 hours in a more congenial locale." Essentially, British doctors in the 30s and 40s followed the money more than the medical need. For the majority of the population, healthcare was a matter of charity. Fundraising parades were a regular sight on Britain's streets, drumming up cash for the great voluntary hospitals that provided desperately needed care for the poor. The hospitals survived primarily on handouts from rich benefactors. But philanthropy alone could never provide all that was needed. Without a radical change, good healthcare would only ever be for the privileged few. There must be another way of organising things, Nye Bevan wrote as a young MP in the 1930s. Born in the South Welsh mining town of Tredegar, he left school aged 13 to work underground in the pits. He saw at first hand what illness amongst the poor looked like and what it felt like. "My heart is full of bitterness," he once said, "for when I see the well-nourished bodies of the wealthy, I also see the ill and haggard faces of my own people." Bevan's political ideals were carved out at the coalface. He had seen friends lose limbs in accidents below ground, and his own father had died from pneumoconiosis, a lung disease that killed thousands every year. Bevan was inspired by a local association that had transformed the lives of miners and their families. Miners suffered regular health problems. Their solution was to group together. The Tredegar Workmen's Medical Aid Society was born, a pioneering scheme providing local healthcare for just pennies a week. The nation needs a tremendous overhaul, the Labour Party wrote in its 1945 manifesto. Churchill had led Britain to victory in the war, but when the country went to the polls after it ended, there was a new hunger for social change.
I am talking to you today because I want to ask you all to help in making this country of ours more prosperous. We've suffered serious destruction of houses and factories, which we've got to rebuild and rebuild quickly. That's the first problem. We've got the enormous job of transforming industry from war purposes to peacetime needs. But just as it took time and careful planning to mobilize for war, so it does for peace. And that's the second problem. The third is this: we have to buy abroad in order to live and prosper. For this country depends, for a great deal of its food and much of its raw material for its industries, on things coming from abroad. We can only buy abroad if we sell abroad. In order to fill the shops, we've also got to fill the ships. Our difficulty is manpower. Put simply, it means there are more jobs to be done than there are men and women to do them. We had the same problem during the war. We overcame it then because everybody pulled together, because workers and managements alike determined to see how output could be increased, because large numbers of women took on jobs in industry, because many who'd reached the retiring age stayed on to help the country, because all of us in factories, in offices, on the farms, in the homes, in the mines, worked perhaps as we'd never worked before. Let us all join together now in one more great effort, this time for victory over scarcity. We showed the world what we could do during the war. Let's show it again now. Let's pull together for prosperity.
Clement Attlee's government promised to build a newer, fairer Britain, and Nye Bevan, above all, claimed this was the moment to create a new society. "We have been the dreamers," "We have been the sufferers," he said. "Now we are the builders." These sweeping social reforms were attacked by the Tories, and Churchill vehemently opposed Bevan's revolutionary ideas from the start. Bevan was the youngest member of Attlee's cabinet, and its most left-wing, a self-proclaimed projectile from the Welsh valleys, and an unashamed socialist.
It seems to me that if we are to safeguard employment in Great Britain, we have to be resolute about it and clear about it and say we can only safeguard employment for British workers by socialist planning in Great Britain and socialist planning in other parts of the world.
If people were frightened of being sick, Bevan thought, they could never be free. Though much had changed in post-war Britain, good medical care was still the preserve of the rich.
There is a school of thought, you know, that believes that if a thing is scarce, it ought to be dear. Although it doesn't cost any more to produce it than if it were plentiful. Now, that's all right from the point of view of orthodox economics. But this isn't an orthodox government, and I'm not an orthodox Minister of Health.
On January the 3rd, 1948, Bevan made his pledge to the nation. Free healthcare would soon be theirs, financed by taxes based on the ability to pay. Yet Bevan had no precedent for the enormous task ahead of him. 6 months was no time to set up Britain's biggest ever social reform. How would he equip the hospitals, recruit the nurses, and stock the pharmacies? Most worryingly, he had to win over his biggest opponents, the medical profession itself, horrified by this attack on their privileged world. Doctors, like lawyers, were a class apart. Independence and hierarchy ran through the profession, from the nurses and student doctors right up to the mighty consultants at the top of the tree in the great hospitals. For decades, the doctors and consultants had run British medicine on their terms and done very well out of it. Why now should they change their ways? The rank and file of the medical profession amounted to an army of more than 35,000. Represented by a hugely influential professional body, the British Medical Association. On the first day of January 1948, the BMA declared war on Bevan's socialist experiment and set out to persuade every doctor in the land to join them. Leading the BMA's opposition was a famously charismatic and outspoken figure to rival Bevan himself, aspiring Conservative politician and secretary of the BMA, Dr. Charles Hill. The BMA could not have had a more powerful spokesman for their cause than Charles Hill, because he was the most famous doctor in the country, dispensing medical wisdom to over 14 million people every week as the BBC's radio doctor.
What can you do if you get an attack of influenza? Well, there's no panacea, there's no golden remedy. Don't believe all the neighbours say about what such and such a stuff has done to them. Bed, warmth, extra hot water bottle, extra blanket so that you perspire.
More than half the BMA's members were GPs, who were terrified that the NHS would lower them to the status of medical civil servants. The BMA encouraged them to reject Bevan's Health Act, as it would rob them not only of their independence, but also their livelihood.
It's obviously quite a job sending out the BMA plebiscite to 56,000 doctors, asking them, roughly speaking, whether they approve of Mr. Bevan's scheme.
In the middle of January, the BMA launched a counter-attack to Bevan. They decided to put the views of all 35,000 members to the test in a vote, a plebiscite. If the doctors voted against the NHS, Bevan would have no workforce to power his health service. Simultaneously, leading opponents fired off a salvo of furious letters to the national press to whip up a frenzy and persuade every doctor in the land to vote no. The BMA's battle over the NHS looked like a class war, and Bevan was a lightning conductor for the fury of the profession, the press, and opposing politicians. The BMA had even gone so far as to compare Bevan to Hitler, a comparison Bevan's arch-rival Churchill would have approved of, having previously equated socialism with dictatorship.
No socialist government could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to...
On the 9th of February, Bevan fought back. His stage was Parliament. For the first time in its history, there was to be a fourth reading of a parliamentary bill. Bevan was determined to show that parliamentary sovereignty ruled the country and not the BMA. Bevan secured the support of Parliament, but the BMA's resistance intensified. Local branch votes were organised across the country to stoke up the opposition. In Newcastle, London and Liverpool, the NHS was rejected unanimously. In Brighton, 350 voted no against a single lone supporter. It took courage for any medic to speak out in favour of the health service. But a minority did brave the opposition. Among them a young nurse, Avis Hutt, and her surgeon husband, Roscoe. Many supporters of the NHS were young students who had joined a radical group called the Socialist Medical Association. In the hostile climate of 1948, they were branded as traitors. In mid-February, with some 4 months to go before his NHS was due to open its doors, the doctor's verdict was ready to be announced. Bevan knew the moment of truth was imminent. The BMA's members' votes were counted in a sealed room. It wasn't long before Bevan discovered the scale of his defeat. Rejection followed rejection followed rejection. More than 30,000, over 85% of the poll, voted against joining the NHS. It was a disaster for Bevan. The voice of the BMA had become stronger and louder than ever.
Let me ask how you propose to work the medical service without doctors. You can't bring in the troops or anything like that.
Let us realise that this temporary Minister of Health is only like a very difficult patient determined to get his own way by whatever means. But this totalitarian socialist government will soon be superseded.
Bevan faced a crisis, personally and politically. No doctors meant no health service. His critics began clamouring for his resignation. 2 days after the plebiscite result, he was scheduled to speak in South Wales to his own people. The country would hear him too. There would be no backing down. Popular support for Bevan's plans was crucially underlined at the start of March, when Gallup published an opinion poll on the National Health Service. In a post-war grip of shortages, rations and endless queues, life in Britain may have looked grey, but the mood was optimistic, excited about the future. The poll revealed overwhelming public support for the NHS. Only 13% were on the side of the doctors. Strengthened by the enthusiasm of the British public, Bevan made the most audacious move of his political life. In a bid to undermine the BMA, he went over the heads of the ordinary GPs who'd rejected him and straight to the door of the grandest doctor in Britain, Lord Moran, the President of the Royal College of Physicians. It was the last roll of the dice to see if he could turn defeat into victory. Lord Moran, it was sometimes said, was the only doctor in the country with just one patient. But what a patient. Yet Churchill and Bevan were still bitter enemies. A petrified adolescent, Bevan had called Churchill. The minister of disease, Churchill spat back. By going to Moran, Bevan was marching into the heart of the enemy camp. If he could win him over, then the rest of the profession might follow. But Moran was as cunning as Bevan. As president of the Royal College, Lord Moran controlled the most prestigious medical group in the country, the consultants. They were the least likely conscripts to a nationalised health industry. For decades, they had been in charge of Britain's great charity hospitals, such as Bart's, St Thomas's, and the London Hospital. But Bevan knew their Achilles' heel. Their famous hospitals were broke. Charity never provided enough. If he could find some way to pour the state's cash into the hospitals and let the surgeons keep their freedom, maybe Moran would help. To clinch the deal, Bevan made Moran a very enticing offer. The consultants could have it both ways. They could work for the state and, if they so chose, carry on making lucrative money out of private patients. With time running out, all Bevan's hopes for launching on July the 5th now rested with Moran. But there was a problem. Moran was up for re-election. His position as head of the Royal College faced an imminent challenge. It came from Lord Horder, the King's personal physician, and one of the most die-hard and outspoken opponents of Bevan's National Health Service. Moran routinely defeated Horder by a majority of 10-1. But in 1948, with Horder campaigning on an anti-NHS ticket, this vote would determine not just the presidency, but the very survival of the NHS. The final vote was 165 to Horder and 170 to Moran. The future of the NHS had turned on 5 consultants' votes. Moran would now lead them into the health service. But what about the GPs? Moran now wrote to Bevan with an audacious suggestion of his own.
My dear Nye, the irrational fears of the GPs that they will become slaves is based on their fear that one day you will turn them into full-time salaried servants of the state. You could eliminate
to get the GPs on board, Bevan should amend the NHS Act to guarantee he would never reduce them to civil servants or wage slaves without launching an entirely new Act of Parliament.
I would, of course, support you in the House of Lords.
2 days later, on the 7th of April, Bevan made this amendment in the Commons. Moran applauded him in the Lords. Their deal was finally sealed. Bevan's sudden political compromise should have been welcome news to the doctors and the BMA, but far from caving in, they simply dug their heels in further. With a fighting fund in place, now they were threatening to strike rather than sign up to the NHS. Facing continued resistance, Bevan kept his cool. He ignored their threats and announced louder than ever that his health service would start, as promised, in 3 months' time. Even though not one doctor was on board, a massive public information campaign was launched to educate the public about the glories of the NHS.
On July 5th, the new National Health Service starts, providing hospital and specialist services, medicines, drugs and appliances, care of the teeth and eyes, maternity services. Have you chosen your family doctor? If not, ask your doctor now if he'll look after you under the new scheme. If he can't accept you, ask at the post office for the address of the Executive Council, where you'll be given the names of other doctors in your area who are taking part in the new service. Ask the doctor you choose for an application form for each member of your family. You can also get these forms from the Executive Council office, the post office, or the public library. Fill in the form like this. One form has to be filled in for each member of the family and then handed over to your doctor. Now don't forget, choose your doctor now.
Bevan believed the doctors' resistance would crack if they faced a groundswell of public demand. His trump card was the unique selling point of the NHS. Everything would cost nothing.
Are you sure I don't have to pay anything for all this?
Nothing. You and your family, having put yourselves on my list, get all the general practitioner services free.
Following the first wave of publicity, over 20 million people signed up for the new service. Bevan's target was higher still, to get 90% of the public registered by July the 5th.
This new health service will be organised on a national scale as a public responsibility. The cost of the service will be met from rates, taxes and national insurance, and so everyone will pay for it.
Thought there was a catch in it.
And everyone will benefit from it. When you're ill, you won't have to pay for treatment.
I don't have to pay the doctor now. I'm on the panel.
Yes, that's true, but your wife and children aren't. The panel system covers only half the population, and it doesn't cover hospital treatment or a lot of other things, does it? Now, suppose, just suppose, you fall off your bike. Suppose your brakes give out. You might have concussion as well. You'd be carted off in an ambulance, which might cost a couple of quid. And then you'd have to pay the hospital too. All right.
Phew. Glad that's over.
The new health service would cover all this.
Advance publicity hit home most strongly with one crucial section of the audience: women.
Suppose your wife falls ill suddenly.
For generations, they had been last in line when working-class families spent precious cash on healthcare.
But my woman never is ill. Strong as a blooming horse she is.
We mothers can't afford to be ill. I'm not insured. Just a minute, Dad. Besides, I can't take time off from my job.
Well, that's just it. Now let's see how the new Health Act will actually help you. The local council will have a new duty to provide home nursing, health visiting and home help services, and you'll be able to call on them. Maternity and child welfare services will be improved. And finally, to prevent illness, you'll have the advice of your own doctor. If you're ill, you'll have specialist services if you need them, without worrying about the cost.
That's more like it.
How does the whole scheme work?
Well, suppose we see how it is at present. Hospitals were built haphazard according to the varying foresight and resources of many different authorities, with extremely patchy results. Reorganizing will take time, but at the end of it, the country will have the sort of hospitals and other services it needs where they are needed. The family doctor will usually work in his own surgery, as he does now. But special health centers will gradually be established as building allows. He'll be backed up, your doctor I mean, by organized hospital and specialist services for the really difficult cases, a lesson we learnt during the war.
Sounds a bit of all right to me, but just a minute. Where do I come in?
Right here. Let's have a practical demonstration. Off you go to the doctor. You have some unusual illness which can't be diagnosed. He'll no doubt wish you to see a specialist. In hospital, you'll be under observation. This will include X-ray if it's found necessary. They may decide you need special drugs or blood transfusion. And they'll be able to make use of the path lab to find out what's wrong and how best to make you well.
Phew. Glad that's over. But look here, how about the people who don't want to use this service? Take old George up the road, for instance. Bet you a pound to a penny he won't want to have anything to do with it.
Well, let's find out.
Morning, George. Busy? Here, what's your opinion of this new Health Act?
No use to me, old man.
Now, wait a minute. Just suppose, only suppose, mind you, you fell off that ladder. What would happen?
I should call my doctor and have a private ward in the local hospital.
All right, George. If you want to pay private fees, that's your lookout. No one's forcing you to use this service. But suppose instead of a simple broken leg, you have a complicated break. And suppose you have to spend months off sick. And suppose you don't need just one doctor, but a number of experts' opinions. What's the answer to that?
Ruined.
With this new act, you're covered against things like that.
I say, thanks a lot, old man.
It's all yours, whenever you want it, with your own choice of doctor. And that goes for the whole family. The scheme is comprehensive. It's not only to help you when you're ill, but to help to keep you well. And, of course, the younger generation will stand to gain the biggest benefits of all.
Bevan also knew the strongest argument for the health service was that it would dramatically improve the lives of Britain's children. With child mortality still a grave concern, up to 10,000 a year dying from diphtheria alone, this was a compelling reason for signing up.
This boy is not expected to live. He was not immunized.
The campaign was a masterstroke.
This leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon, or maybe you have already had your copy. Read it carefully. It tells you what the new National Health Service is and how you can use what it offers. Remember all the leaflet says. Get an application form from any post office, complete it, and send it to your doctor. If the doctor you have chosen can look after you,
within 5 weeks, 75% of the British public had filled in NHS registration forms. It was an unpleasant dose of reality for the BMA. Their resistance was totally out of step with millions of British people. In desperation, and unwisely, they arranged a second plebiscite. The majority of doctors were still against signing up, but almost 40% had changed their minds and now voted for the NHS. The tide was turning. The number of Britain's doctors bowing to the inevitable was rising daily. It wasn't long before those who held out began to fear that they might be losing out.
Now don't forget, choose your doctor now.
Forced into a corner with just 5 weeks left before July the 5th, the BMA finally advised all remaining doctors to join the NHS. It was a retreat, but not a surrender. They now switched tactics, hoping still to scupper Bevan's plans. Knowing how much political capital Bevan had staked on July the 5th, they called on him to delay. The start date was unrealistic and impractical. Nothing would be ready. Bevan should push it back or face chaos. Bevan was too proud a politician to back down now. But privately, he knew there were serious hurdles to overcome. His 6-month timetable was far too short to deal with the practicalities of launching the NHS. In just 2 years, the estimated start-up costs had almost doubled to £180 million, the second biggest charge to the Treasury after the military. Britain's existing medical services were desperately ill-equipped to meet the impending demands of the new service. Most of our 3,000 hospitals were crumbling, either from age or from the Blitz. With just 5 weeks to go till the NHS opened its doors, Bevan's problems continued to get worse. It wasn't just the buildings and equipment falling short. He still had only a small proportion of the staff the NHS would need.
Nurse.
Nurse Edwards, can you go to her?
Our nurses are busy and overworked because there aren't enough of them. Many hospitals have closed wards because of that.
A last-minute campaign was launched to find 30,000 new nurses to tend to almost 400,000 hospital beds.
Who will help? You will? Good. But you can't like that, you know. Ask at your local Ministry of Labour office or a hospital for details of how to become a nurse. There are 30,000 needed.
The pressure on Bevan continued to mount to the bitter end. Now the press was on his back, predicting another disaster. They claimed that free healthcare to 50 million Britons would result in an anarchic free-for-all. As Bevan's appointed day approached, apprehension turned to nervousness. Would the hospitals come up to scratch? The nurses be trained? Or would everything fall apart as demand soared overnight? All eyes were now on the Health Minister. With less than 24 hours to go to the crucial moment, Bevan went to speak at a Labour rally in Manchester. It should have been a speech of victory. He had defeated fierce opposition and brought down the doctors. But for 6 months, his resentment and rage had been boiling. He let rip with an unprecedented tirade against his most hated enemy of all, the Tory party.
That is why no amount of cajoling and no attempts at ethical or social seduction can eradicate from my heart a deep, burning hatred for the Tory party that inflicted those bitter experiences on me. So far as I am concerned, they are lower than vermin. They condemned millions of first-class people to semi-starvation.
The impact was instant and disastrous. Within hours of the speech, the newspaper headlines led not on the doors opening to the NHS, but on the minister's dramatic insult to half the nation.
The difference between socialism and communism is not one of principle or theory, it is a difference of method. The socialists pursue their aims by constitutional methods. It is their right, and sincerely but vainly hope to preserve individual liberty. They are our fellow countrymen, however misguided, even though Mr. Bevan calls us vermin. We must regard them as brothers with whom, yes, certainly, we must regard the other half of our fellow countrymen as brothers apart from their politics and realize that we have much in common with them.
Bevan's speech had threatened to overshadow the birth of his service. But throughout Britain, the medical profession, many of whom had resisted him, worked to the last minute in preparation for the potential flood of millions of new patients.
Tomorrow, there will come into operation the most comprehensive system of social security ever introduced into any country. We may be proud that Britain, which has given the lead in so many things to the world, is still in the forefront of social advance. In the building up of the great structure of our social services, all parties in the state have borne their part. I am therefore not speaking to you in any controversial spirit, but I consider it right that as Prime Minister I should tonight say something of what this means to every one of you and to the nation. First, a word as to the past. I remember that when I first went to work in East London, apart from what was done by voluntary organizations and by private charity, and apart from the obligations imposed on employers in respect of industrial injury, the only provision for the citizen who through sickness, old age, or unemployment was in need of assistance was that given by the Poor Law. The Poor Law was still based on the principle of deterrence, the principle that the necessitous were in a sense offenders against society. It was assumed that the individual could and should make provision against every contingency. The Poor Law was designed to be, and indeed it was, the last refuge of the destitute. Now I turn to the National Health Service. We're seeking here not merely to provide services for those who are sick, but to make a healthy nation. The aim is to ensure that the provision of proper care and treatment shall not depend on financial resources, and that when you are sick, you will be free from the money worries which so often accompany illness. The scheme gives a complete cover for health by pooling the nation's resources and paying the bill collectively. It's not dependent on insurance. Everyone is eligible. It covers all kinds of care: doctor, dentist, midwife, health visitor, oculist and optician, and surgeon. It provides for treatment in hospitals and sanatoria, and for the services of specialists of all kinds. Help in the home when people are sick will be given wherever possible. Spectacles, dentures, appliances, and artificial limbs will be available. But a word of caution is necessary. It will take time to develop. We shall have to start with what we have, and then work up to a full service when our present shortages have been overtaken. You all know that owing to the war, there are great arrears to be made up in the provision of hospitals and in the reinforcement of medical and nursing staffs. We shall have to be a bit lenient with the service at first. I do not think that I need go into the question of the relationship between doctor and patient under the new scheme, as it's been so fully discussed, or into the question of the basis of payment, which has now been accepted. The remuneration of those taking part has been based on the principle that all of them, doctors, dentists and nurses alike, can earn full professional incomes on lines worked out by independent committees. Our hospital system, which has grown up in a haphazard way, partly through voluntary efforts and partly through municipal provision, will from tomorrow become one great service. With few exceptions, all hospitals will pass into the country's ownership. But they'll not be run from Whitehall, but by voluntary local bodies. There'll be just as much need of personal interest and individuality as before. Here then is our new scheme of social security for all. I believe that it will increase the health and happiness of our people, and I ask you all to join in working it wholeheartedly, so it may bring new strength and well-being to our country. Good night.
The time had come. Finally, on the stroke of midnight on July the 5th, Bevan's dream became a reality. The National Health Service opened for business as promised. That morning, all over the country, 50 million Britons woke up to a new world of free healthcare for the masses.
Hello, surgery switchboard.
Hello, outpatient appointments.
Yes, you could see Dr. Midgley this afternoon at 2:20 or one of the other doctors this evening.
With the NHS less than half a day old, Bevan paid a triumphant visit to Trafford Park Hospital in Manchester. Bevan toured the hospital like a proud father. He stopped off at the bedside of a 13-year-old patient, Sylvia Diggory, and posed for an historic photograph that came to symbolise everything he had fought for. Against all the odds, Bevan had delivered, both on his 6-month timetable and on the basic promise of the NHS. Comprehensive healthcare for every person in Britain was now completely free, from the simplest ailment to the most urgent surgery. The public embraced Bevan's free health scheme with open arms. The NHS's opponents had predicted it would be subject to abuse. At first, it seemed they may have been right. But more seriously, the NHS was buckling under the sheer weight of demand. The demand of countless illnesses and problems that had gone untreated. Because, until now, patients couldn't pay the price. Yet despite the drain on the public purse and the agonising 6-month battle over its birth, the changes that Bevan's NHS made to Britain's health were immediate and dramatic.
The health service started in an atmosphere of friction, of controversy, of doubt, and of great hopes. There has gone on in the past a vast amount of silent suffering, a vast amount of remediable pain, and I believe in Great Britain we have made a great start.
Within just 10 years, infant mortality had halved. Life expectancy increased dramatically. Death from infectious diseases had fallen by over 80%. For many, the NHS was not merely Nye Bevan's finest hour, but the greatest political achievement of the century.